The questions that we're debating tonight cover a number of different concepts. We're talking both about globalization or international economic integration and technocracy. We are talking about institutions, whether democratic or not, and outcomes, the policies they choose. Those are not all the same things. And what I'd like to do to begin with, I think, is to maybe clarify some of these concepts, because it's very easy, I think, to be led astray if we think they all mean the same thing. If you forgive me for starting in a somewhat abstract way, I find very useful as a starting point Dani Rodriks' Globalization Trilemma, which I'm sure many of you know about, but I will just go through it very quickly. Dani Rodrik is an economist at Harvard who's at the same time very much a neoclassical economist and a bit of a hero of the anti-globalization movement. Partly because he says that you can be a mainstream neoclassical economist and see big problems with globalization, including democratic problems. He's posited a trilemma, three things that you can't have all three of at the same time. The three things being economic globalization, economic integration across borders. That's the one thing. The second thing is the nation state or national sovereignty, national self-determination. And the third thing is democracy, as understood as some sort of mass involvement and mass politics, popular influence on what the political choices are. So Rodriks says you can have globalization and the nation state, but the nation state won't be democratic because it will just follow internationally set rules. You can have globalization and democracy, but only if you have an international superstate that democratically then decides things at an international level, so no nation state. Or you can have the classical democratic nation state, but then you have to give up on economic globalization. That's putting it quite starkly. He really says you can't have all of these things to their fullest extent at the same time. I find that, as I've said, a very useful conceptual starting point. I don't quite agree, and I will tell you why. But it's a powerful way of thinking about things, and I think it clarifies our thinking, whether or not we agree with the analysis. Now notice, first of all, it's globalization, it's not technocracy. So I want to pause first to talk about the relationship between globalization and technocracy. Is there one, and is there necessarily one? And I tend to think that, no, technocracy, although it seems to be correlated with economic globalization, they've happened at the same time. And technocratic rules seem to come with economic integration across borders. EU directives or trade rules, like the trade agreements that John was talking about. But there's no necessary link there, even if things that happen at the same time don't necessarily depend on one another. And I'd like just to remind you how neutral technocracy, technocratic rules actually are with respect to what outcomes they favor. Remember, or hark back to mid-century European social democracy. For a lot of people, this was the golden age, the sort of social democratic states most of Europe had in the 1950s, 60s, early 70s. That was a very technocratic sort of state. I grew up in Norway in the 80s, and I remember this. I mean, think about the Soviet Union. I mean, that was probably the most technocratic regime man has ever known. It was not democratic. And of course, the EU is technocratic. The United States is very technocratic. Anyone who's lived in the US will just laugh at this notion that it's the home of the free and so on. And I will just put it to you that even a country that isolated itself economically, to the extent that it wanted to be a modern economy at all, it would still be quite highly technocratic. Because modern economies are complex. And the way they work is by a number of standards, a number of rules that make people coordinate. That you can mention any kind of trivial example, the acceptable amount of voltage in your electricity sockets, the width of railways, I happen to have a 3-year-old, so I'm sort of interested in the regulations governing the security standards, safety standards of bicycle seats for toddlers. These things are technocratic. That doesn't mean that they're either bad in themselves. That depends on what those technocratic rules are. It depends on the content. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're undemocratic either. That depends on how they were generated, right? And are they anchored in a process that citizens feel they have some sort of control over? It's not undemocratic that it's illegal to produce certain substandard type of toddler bike seats. Okay? So technocracy will be with us. What we have to do is to make sure that it's democratically anchored, whether or not we integrate economically. Now, there are special challenges when this happens across borders, and we'll no doubt discuss that. But I just want to leave that as a point for now. So let's go back to globalization specifically. Rodriks' trilemma is you can't have globalization and then both of national sovereignty, national self-determination, and democracy in that self-determination. I think that's overly complicated. It's not obvious to me that even dictatorships that are full-on globalizers, that there are things they can do that democracies can't do. Or alternatively, if globalization binds, it's not clear that a democracy is bound any more than a non-democratic nation-state. The conflict, if there is one, is really between global economic activity and setting rules at the national level, regardless of whether those rules are set democratically or not. If you could, it's a strange thought experiment, but if you imagined authoritarian or dictatorial state being a member of the EU, I think they would feel as hemmed in as democracies do. Maybe imagine Turkey under its current government, if it really was an EU member. It's already hemmed in by a lot of EU rules because it's in a customs union with the EU. It can't set its own tariffs. But how democratic or authoritarian Turkey is becoming, I don't think changes that. Now, there is, of course, a sort of definitional conflict between national self-determination and globalization. If globalization means allowing goods or services made in other countries into your own country and vice versa, if it means allowing workers from other countries into your own country, or if it means allowing capital flows from other countries into your own country, then of course by definition there are some things you nationally cannot do, namely lock those things out. So there's a definitional conflict. If you want economic activity across borders, then you can't at a national level stop that economic activity across borders. But that doesn't really get us very far, right? That doesn't get us into a deep, inherent conflict between cross-border economic activity and national self-determination. And from now on, I'll just talk about national democracy because of what I said right before, that it's democracy at the national level that matters. Dictatorship doesn't really get you out of this. But there are a number of other ways in which there's not so much of a conflict. So, yes, definitionally, if you have international capital flows or international worker movements or international trade in goods and services, by definition you don't nationally block those. But you still have a national choice in the extent to which you have these things. Do you want trade in goods and services but not free movement of workers? Do you want the opposite? Do you want capital but not goods? Do you want capital but not workers? Do you want workers but not capital? And how much of these things do you want? These are gradual, these are spectra of choices, right? It's not binary. It's not economic globalization and no globalization. And where you end up on that spectrum is a political choice. The history of the EU has been gradual choices to go towards more integration and more common rules. But that doesn't mean those weren't choices. And it doesn't mean that the choice isn't available to step back from that. I mean, the fact that we are facing a referendum in the UK on whether to remain a member of the EU, I think rather proves that there's no democratic obstacle to reversing globalization. It's a choice that's there. It's even codified in the treaty, Article 50, which you've heard about. And ultimately, both the law and power remains at the national level. The country can leave when it wants to. And even if it breaks the treaties, you can withdraw from treaties. That's legal. And even if it's not, what can anyone else do? Well, they can maybe not want to trade with you, but you can't require others to do something without their collaboration. So again, there's a lot of choice there. Now, are these choices more or less democratic because they are more economically integrated? In other words, do we get less democratic the more economically integrated we are? Well, I don't think that either. Self-government is really about the degree to which you control your environment and your destiny. That's what self-government is. And I'm using the word self-government because I want to make the point that this is true at the level of states, but it's also true at the level of individuals, right? Your own self-government is about the sort of control you have and freedom you have in your environment, economically and politically. And this is why we don't say that there's a problem of self-government, that you live in a state in the first place, right? The fact that we live in a state where laws are voted on in a certain way, and then you have to follow them whether or not you agree with them, that's not anti-democratic, that's democracy, if the process is right. So the fact that you don't decide everything yourself is obviously not a sign of the lack of democracy or lack of self-government at the level of individuals, at the level of regions within a country, or at the level of states in the international community. Of course, there can be a lack of democracy, but the fact of deciding things together does not mean a lack of democracy. And the fact is that most of what the European Union does is to decide things together. So the whole premise of the European Union is that we, European nation states, can decide that it's better for us all if we have common rules. Now, you may agree or disagree with that. But certainly it's within the scope of national democracy to exercise that democracy by trying to sit down and make common rules with others. That is the European project. Okay? So to the extent that that is what's happening, I don't think that there's a democratic deficit. Now, that's not always what's happening. But in large part, everything that's decided in the EU has been approved by national governments, which are all democratically elected, have strong democratic mandates. It's true that actual laws formally have to be proposed by the Commission, and they are, but they will often be proposed at the request of national governments. That's the European Council. They will never become law unless they're approved by the European Council, by very large majorities, not unanimity anymore. Margaret Thatcher helped get rid of that, moving to what's called qualified majority, sort of a large majority. And the reason was in order to make it easier to have common rules. And it has to be approved by the European Parliament, which has gained a lot more power after the Nice Treaty. It's true that, again, they don't initiate things, but they can request things. And in practice, they do put things in. And I think the most telling example is the EU ban on excessive bankers' bonuses. So there's now an EU law against paying bankers more than twice, with some details, more than twice their salary as a bonus. That came from the European Parliament, the Greens in particular, who have a good team in the economic affairs area. It was part of what they said, we want this in order to approve other things, capital markets regulations. So maybe it was accounting, some obscure regulation. The government ministers, the governments in the European Council wanted to get the package through. The European Parliament said, well, you'll only get it through if you also accept this. George Osborne was very much set against it. Everybody else, every other country was for it. They voted it through. It all went through. It is the law of the land, more or less, says the Bank of England, and the UK is trying to get around it. This is not undemocratic, right? It's also probably a good policy, but as I said, whether or not it's a good policy is different from whether it was democratically decided. It was something that happens to go against the desire of the UK government of the day, as part of a system to which successive UK governments have agreed to, and successive governments of all the member states have agreed to, that we should try to have rules in common on a large number of things. Again, that might be a bad idea, but that in itself has been a democratic choice. And again, of course, when you decide to have common rules, you won't always get the rule you want, but you will get a rule that can get through this sort of system, and that means it must command a majority among organs that are democratically elected, national governments and the European Parliament. Now, there are quite clearly problems. It's not quite as idyllic as I've set it out to be. That is my overall view, that this idea of a democratic deficit is a bit of a misunderstanding. Of course, things don't get decided by national governments, but that kind of goes with the territory of trying to have common rules. Okay? But things could be better. So I want to end by talking about some of the ways in which there are, let's call them democratic imperfections. One is that national politicians, who do have democratic mandates, I suppose everyone will agree with that, it's very much in their interest to blame either the bureaucracy, the Brussels bureaucracy, or the courts, the European courts, not to mention the European Court of Human Rights, which is not part of the EU, for obvious reasons of politics. But we should just be aware that they protest a little bit too much. There's a lot more influence national governments have or could have. There's a lot more influence national parliaments have or could have. Next time you hear parliamentarians here complain about undue influence from Brussels, ask yourselves how often the British Parliament holds the British government to account, either before or after a European Council meeting, for how it bargains with other governments. So some of this is just presentational. Things are presented as being less democratic than they are. But there are real democratic imperfections. Like any bureaucracy, the European Commission is always eager to do more. It's always eager to do more at the European level. The principle of subsidiarity, which is a principle that things should be done at the lowest possible level, is not honored as it should be. But of course, you don't see national governments using the European Court of Justice to try to stop that. So again, some of the blame here is on not using the sort of institutions that are available. There's something else that's specific, I think, about doing things across borders, which is that for the same reason that it's hard to get things through, you need everyone's agreement, or most people's agreement. It's also hard to undo things. And that is a real difference from a national government, where a new government can undo what a previous government has done, because things depend on so many more players in the European Union. It's much harder to undo previous bad laws, for example. And there are certainly things that could be improved there. You could make laws with sunset clauses, right? You could say this expires after 10 years unless it's voted back in, perhaps with amendments depending on what elected representatives in 10 years want. But again, this is something that national governments have had the ability to do, and they've chosen not to. You can have a sort of spring cleaning and try to remove too much technocracy, but of course that is deregulation, right? So that there's also, you can't both complain about technocracy and about deregulation at the same time. Better regulation is presumably what we want, and we will disagree on what the best regulation is, but that's also part of democracy, that we'll have to work that out in a political process. Now, finally, we get to that key, right, the political process. I agree with John that to a large extent, or to an excessive extent, politics has been taken out of things. Probably not as much as you think, John, but I agree in principle, if not in degree. And let's take this example of the euro. Now, the euro has ended up looking a bit like a trap. Remember that it was sold to citizens of Europe on the basis of a number of promises. To the German electorate in particular, the promise was we will not have to pay money, bail out other countries if they get into trouble. There was a legal clause in there that I don't really think made it illegal, but there was certainly a political promise. Some of the other countries were promised a sort of parity with Germany that they hadn't had under the previous system of national exchange rates, where what you found was that the independence you supposedly had was the independence, the freedom to do exactly what the Bundesbank did within 15 minutes of a decision in Frankfurt. So there was a promise that by having a common central bank, everyone would actually be equal in these monetary policy decisions. Of course, what's happened is that the citizens of the Eurozone have been told that once you have the euro, the only way to make it work is to violate all of those promises. The core countries, the creditor countries, have to bail the others out, and those that are bailed out have to accept diktats on their policy. That is what's played out in the crisis. That's an actual description of what's happened in the crisis. And it's also the intellectual vision of where the euro has to go, intellectual and political, I should say. John, I think, mentioned the Five Presidents report, this sort of official roadmap, which says for the euro to really work, we also need a fiscal union, we need regular budgetary transfers, and we need a centralization of some policy choices, partly in order to justify, partly in order to secure how that money is used. So it's quite true that the direction of travel is towards less national autonomy. And because these are democracies, that means less national democracy. I don't think that is a necessary consequence of having a single currency. I think rather that it's the consequence of an entirely avoidable, unnecessary, but bad choice that was made early in the crisis, which was a choice to forswear the write-downs and restructuring of debts. The debts of states, such as Greece, and the debts of private banks, such as the Irish banks. The choice back in 2010 that all debts have to be honored in full set up a sort of political economy within the Eurozone that pitted creditors against debtors and mapped nation states onto those categories. So you suddenly had a conflict between the creditor states and the debtor states. Now, there is no sovereignty for debtors that cannot service their debt in a system that doesn't allow for debts to be written down or restructured. That's not a fact about the euro, that's not a fact about economic globalization, and it's not a fact about capitalism, because problems with debts and problems between creditors and debtors have been with us much, much longer than capitalism has. The earliest writings, human writings, are tallies of debt. And I'm not a religious person, but I've been deeply impressed by how all the great religions have very strict rules about debt. How you can build it up, what interest rates you can charge, and the requirement to forgive debt at regular intervals. Jubilees. All the great religions have this. And that tells me that problems of debt and the sort of social havoc it can cause, a debt bubble can cause, is something that's been with us for thousands of years, and we've learnt about it and unlearnt it and had to rediscover it again and again at a very high price, and the same thing has just happened. But that has nothing to do with globalization. That happens within countries too. The problem is that the leaders of the Eurozone chose, they forswore the option of restructuring debts. And that set up this dependence of debtors on creditors, and that gave power to the creditors. And a lot of the things that have been imposed flow simply from that. Now you may ask, well, why do people impose those policies? Why is it what many of you will call neoliberal policies, structural reforms, a certain vision of what the economy should look like that certainly people on the left don't like? Well, I think it's because a lot of people believe that these are the right policies, and they use their power, abuse their power, to impose them. But the people who do this are democratically elected. So the problem we have here, if you look across the Eurozone, across the EU, it's parties who have tended to believe this, that have won elections. So I think democracy, there's much more democracy available than is being used. To the extent that democracy is being used, it's unfortunately often, the democratic battle is often won by people who believe in bad and sometimes unjust policies. Now, I don't have a good solution to that problem except going out there and campaigning more for better policies. But what I do believe is that undoing economic integration, the euro, the EU, and putting back up national boundaries is not going to help the problem. Thank you very much.